Okay, so once we figure out what we need to do to look at characters to determine the complexity of them, we also need to understand that we have different types of characters, or that they are many-sided and are very complex in their personalities, much like your own self and your friends and your family members. There are two types of characters that we find in a story. The first one is dynamic. A dynamic character is a character that's personality will change either for the better or for the worse by the end of the story. So a dynamic character is a character that comes through some change in who they are, what they believe in. Novels often have storylines that have dynamic characters. The second type of character that you run across is static characters. Static characters are characters' personalities that will remain the same throughout the story and are even emphasized for this character trait. For example, we might have a brilliant detective like in the Sherlock Holmes novels. That character is static. He's always a brilliant detective. Or the cruel stepmother in Sleeping Beauty or Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. That cruel stepmother personality does not change. It's static. The very first story you're going to read in 8th grade is called The Treasure of Lemon Brown. It's a very short story. It takes place in the span over about 2 to 3 hours. So those characters remain static. They don't have any big changes in their personalities. Okay? Now, the other part of the exposition then is to deal with setting. If the author does not do a very good job of setting up the exposition, we have a really hard time getting into or buying into the story. So, Adora Welty said that every story would be another story and unrecognizable if it took up its characters and its plot and it happened somewhere else. And the purpose of this quote is to get you to understand how important the setting of a story is. So if we took the story, The Outsiders, and we put them into Sutton's Bay, we would not have the same story. Because part of what makes that story work is the inner city struggle between the two groups living on the south side and the north side of the tracks. When writers develop a setting, they describe the world that they know using sights, sounds, colors, and textures. And sometimes the world that the author knows, the setting, is all in their head, such as Hogwarts Castle and the village of Hogsmeade. However, if you read the Harry Potter series carefully, you will find many, many references to England and to London, which the author knew a lot about. Setting also includes the time and location in which the story takes place. When you come through elementary school and you kind of get up here to middle school, you start to realize that setting isn't just the actual place where the story happens. There are more elements to it. So, setting actually has 5 elements to it. The first one is the geographical location, or the place. So you should be writing this down on your study guide. The second element of setting is time. Historical period is easy. Zachary Beaver took place in the 1960s during the Vietnam War. The Boy in Striped Pajamas takes place during World War II. The True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle takes place in 1835. But it also can refer to the time of day. In the story The Treasure of Lemon Brown, it takes place in the evening of a school day. Or it can even reference the year that it takes place. Okay? The weather conditions can impact a story. Is it rainy, stormy, sunny? It may not run through the entire story itself, but the change in the weather can impact the setting. So, for example, in The True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle, there's a major storm, a hurricane, that causes all kinds of problems for the characters. This is the most difficult one for kids to get a handle on. This is in addition to what you learned in 7th grade. We now need to look at the social conditions. This is the way people go about their daily life, the way they speak, the way they dress, or the customs of their particular place. When you get to 9th grade, you will read a book called To Kill a Mockingbird. To Kill a Mockingbird is set in Alabama in the 1930s. And the book is written with the Southern dialect, meaning that when you read the words that the characters are speaking, there are y'alls and we're fixin' to. There's a lot of Southern dialect, and it makes the book not only very interesting to read, but a little bit challenging. So we have to understand that the social conditions play a very important role into understanding the story. The last element to setting is the mood or the atmosphere. What feeling is being created? Is it a cheerful, happy story, or is it dark and frightening? Or is it a sad story? Is it mournful? Okay? The mood and the atmosphere of the story can change throughout the story, much like the weather conditions can. They're dynamic, they will change. The conflict in the story is essential to the plot. Without it, we don't have one. Okay? So the conflict is the opposing forces, the opposition. So think of it like two magnets. When they're turned the right ways with their polars being opposite, they connect right together, they stick together. But when you flip them over so that the positive and the negative are together, the magnets push away from each other. Do you remember doing that experiment when you were little? Okay. So the opposition of those forces ties the incidents in the story together, and they make the story move forward. So it is the conflict that pushes the characters forward to make the story happen. Conflict is in a form that opposes the main character. That's what's going on. The main character is trying to resolve conflict. And sometimes there's only one dominant struggle, one big conflict going on, and sometimes there's lots of little conflicts going on. So in the story when Zachary Beaver came to town, we had the conflict of Zachary Beaver, of Paulie running off and leaving Zachary Beaver behind. We had the conflict of Wayne going to Vietnam. We even had a little conflict of his sister learning how to drive a car, right? We had the conflict of Toby's mother going off to get her record contract in Nashville. So we've got all these opposing forces pushing against our main character, Toby. He is involved in all of these conflicts. Oops. There are two types of conflicts. There's internal conflict, and an internal conflict is a struggle with oneself. So it is an internal conflict when a character must make a decision, overcome pain, whether it be physical pain or emotional pain, quiet their temper when they have a temper problem, much like Dally did in The Outsiders, or resist an urge or a temptation. Okay? So those are internal conflicts, when a character is struggling with a decision or actions of themselves. External conflicts are conflicts that occur outside of the character's own feelings and emotions. So they're struggling with something outside of them. Now there are different types of external conflict. There are 4 main types. Man versus man. Now ladies, don't get offended. They mean humans versus humans, not male versus male. Okay? So, man versus man is a conflict where two humans, like Harry and Voldemort, if you want to call them human, are opposing each other. Okay? I'll get back to it in a minute. Continue on, please. Man versus nature. This is a conflict where we see struggles against animals or forces of nature. The first book you're going to be reading this year is called Touching Spirit Bear by Ben Mickelson. Our main character, or our protagonist, Cole, gets banished to an island off of the coast of Alaska. And he has a lot of conflicts with the weather. He has a lot of internal conflicts as well, but his main conflict is with a white bear. He gets attacked by the bear. Yeah, that's a man versus nature conflict. Okay? Man versus circumstances. This is where our character struggles against fate or something just happening to them that they can't control. So it's kind of like circumstances are what life hands you. You being in this class is circumstance. The schedule put you here. Okay? So it's not your fate, it's just what life handed you. This was your schedule, this is when you're supposed to be in here. The last one is man versus society. This is where we struggle against ideas, practices, or customs. You're going to read a short story called The Lottery. The Lottery is about a group of people that have lived by a tradition or a custom for the last 200 years, and they're starting to think this isn't such a good idea. They're starting to struggle against the custom. So it's a man versus society conflict. Now, the interesting thing about conflicts is there's no one conflict found in a story. There's usually a dominant conflict, one that rises above the rest, but stories often have lots of these conflicts in them. There might be a man versus man and a man versus nature conflict in the story. So there can be more than one. The last one is man versus himself. He struggles with his own self, his soul, his idea of right and wrong, and his physical limitations or personal choices. Okay? The very last thing that we come against is theme. Theme is not intended to teach or preach at you. Instead, it's not even presented directly at all. You find it in the actions and the setting that make up the story. In other words, you have to figure it out. So, theme, the definition of theme is an idea or a thread that controls the entire piece.